Hey everyone, Steve from the Political Reality Podcast here. Just a quick update. We said that we were going to release our episode on ranked choice voting for episode number 2. But given the state of things, we decided that instead we're going to release our episode on how to measure the strength of democracy. How strong is your democracy? Do we even live in a democracy? We're going to explore all of those questions in episode number 2, which will drop on Wednesday, January 14th. Hope you enjoy the episode.
So, Steve, do you know what the most democratic country in the world is?
The most democratic country in the world, Switzerland?
Close, geographically.
Okay.
Not quite. The correct answer is, well, it depends on how you measure it. But if you measure it according to my favorite measure of democracy, which we'll talk about in a moment, the answer is Denmark.
Denmark, okay.
Denmark. And do you know what the least democratic country in the world is?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is North Korea. Is that even close?
It's close, but it's not the winner. You want to make one more guess?
I
will give you $2,000 if you get this right.
Sri Lanka. I don't know.
Eritrea.
Eritrea.
All right, 2,000 stays with
I
me.
have no chance of that.
But again, Steve, the real answer is that it does depend on how you measure
Of course,
it. Because you do
yeah.
get different answers depending on how you measure something as abstract as democracy.
We're Steve and Andrea, and this is the Political Reality Podcast.
And today we are here to talk about how to measure democracy. There's a lot of talk in the news, Steve. I don't know if you've seen it, fussing about whether or not the United States is becoming less democratic. It's pretty much all some of us can think about. And the answer to that is, indeed, it depends on how you measure democracy. Mm-hmm. And there have been a lot of different operations out there over decades and decades to try to measure democracy. We'll talk about some of those today, their strengths and weaknesses. But really, I would say, the headline of all of this is that these measures are really hard to put together, and they're very hard to track reliably in real time. Mm-hmm. So all of the numbers I'm going to tell you today are through the end of 2024. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's been like a thing or two that has happened in 2025 that might affect these numbers.
End of 2024 is like almost completely obsolete.
Yeah. So there has been more recent efforts by, for example, the New York Times to release more immediate updated measures that kind of take into account what just happened or up to the most recent month. But the trade-off, as we'll see, is that you're going to have sort of less robust inputs. You're going to have less information and less of a broader picture. You're going to be much more susceptible to reaction to recency bias and things like that.
Yeah, maybe we need to have like a democracy meter in the background.
I think that we should.
And just every episode, you'll see it just moving farther and farther in the wrong direction. Yeah.
Well, we don't know. It depends on how you measure it,
I guess
Steve.
So.
All right.
So what I've read was that there's like one measure looks at two things, and another one looks at 450
that's
different
about
parameters,
right.
and that's the range that we're talking about.
Right.
So which parameters are the key, though? Like, I could take a guess.
Well, I'm going to have you do it this way if you want. So I don't know if in medicine it works this way, but in social science, when we talk about how to measure something, so we might measure democracy, we might measure freedom, we might measure trust in government, all this kind of stuff that we care about. We want to turn that abstract thing into a concrete number that we can compare with other countries. And it has to be specific enough that we have some variation between the countries, but general enough, and for these international measures, because we're going to be comparing the U.S. to other countries, it has to be general enough where a 7 in the U.S. is comparable to a 7 somewhere else.
Right.
So it's a little bit tricky across nations. I mean, does
Yeah.
that happen?
I mean, in medicine, we sometimes have to measure vague things like pain. How
Yeah.
much pain are you in? That's totally subjective.
Sure.
So we use a visual analog scale, for example.
The little
It's just-
faces.
Yeah, the little faces are just like, I'm here, on the analog scale, but it is subjective.
Right. And presumably what I think is a frowny face is not the same thing that you think is a frowny face,
Right.
and you take that into account in your assessment.
Yeah, but if you're at least using the same measure over time
Right.
within a person, then it tells you something. It's
Right.
harder to compare different people. So I guess it's the
Right.
same way. Like, so maybe if we're measuring democracy in the U.S. over time, that's more reliable than comparing the United States to Finland, where the variables may not line up the same way.
In general, and in fact, you've tapped into a great divide in political science where there are political scientists who claim that you really can't quantitatively compare. You're literally in the apples versus oranges world,
Yeah.
and there's no point. Whereas others would argue there is a point. You just have to be a little bit more nuanced
Yeah.
and take into account that they're all not going to be the same. So when we want to turn something like democracy into a number, we go through 3 steps. Step 1, conceptualization. So what do you mean by democracy? Step 2 is going to be operationalization. Given what you've decided democracy means, how do you turn that into a number? And then step 3, validation. Let's look at all the numbers we've assigned and look back at the world and say, do we think we've captured this?
Yeah, okay.
So I'm going to ask you to go through, we're going to go through these steps.
Alrighty.
So the hardest, I think, is conceptualization. So when I say democracy, or if I say how democratic is a country, what sorts of things might you be looking for?
Well, I think the core definition of democracy, as far as I understand, is that the people get to decide stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Just
Yep.
that the people are in charge to some extent through some mechanism. But there's all different kinds of potential mechanisms, like in the United States. And let me ask you, I want to
Yeah.
flip this around and
All
ask
right.
you a question, because I get this a lot, and I know that this has become popular in some corners of social media to say, well, actually, the United States isn't a democracy, it's a constitutional republic. To which I say, meh, it's
Yeah.
both. It's clearly
doesn't matter.
both.
Yeah.
It's not, so you could be a constitutional republic, you can be a representative democracy. There's
Right.
different flavors of democracy. As long as by some mechanism the people are deciding how decisions are made.
Right. And this gets back into the, what we're talking about on these scales, or at least these are the scales that I find most persuasive and across at an international, cross-national level, are non-democracy or, dictatorship, authoritarian, all the way up to democracy. Within democracy, or say you're in the top suite of democratic countries, of course there's a diversity of democracy, parliamentary democracy, this democracy, that democracy. When we can talk about if we're a constitutional or what have you, but that's of less interest to me. That's sort of like, what kind, do we have apples? Okay, and then we can debate what type of apple
If it's
we
a
have.
Macintosh or a Delicious. Or
Right,
whatever,
right. I would say we're squarely in Macintosh territory in the United States these days.
Not Gala. You don't think?
No,
it's
we're way too mealy for Gala.
All right.
We left Gala behind. That's the metric we need, is an apple.
the Apple metric of democracy.
I seek Cosmic Crisp myself for this country. That's my platform that I'll be running on. All right, so the people are deciding stuff.
Yes.
How are they doing that?
Mainly by voting.
That's right.
Right.
So generally, the first thing that comes to people's mind is elections when you come to democracies. And so you've actually tapped into, well, let me ask you this. So let's stick with elections.
Yes.
How would you did a country have an election? How many elections? How would you start to turn that into a number? I'm really putting you on the spot because this is like decades of many people's research.
I'm trying to replicate
Yeah, you're gonna
decades of
do it right
research
now.
in real time. So what you're saying is, how do we operationalize voting, like to make it?
Or having elections. So if the United States has elections and Finland has elections, would you give them, say, a 1 for each in terms of
Just for the fact that they had elections.
Yeah, or 0 or they didn't have an election? Like, that's one way.
Well, isn't it also like how free and fair are the elections? You have
Yes.
to quantify if the elections are rigged, they could be completely fake.
Yes. So you've stumbled onto, or you've walked purposely onto something that political scientists slowly found their way into as they said, well, okay, a democracy is a country. The simplest metric out there for democracy is it has an election. So if a country has an election, it's a democracy. There's an immediate problem with that, which is exactly what you said, which is a lot of countries that do not really feel like democracies to us do hold elections. So a number of researchers came along and said, well, we need to refine this somehow. And this is where we're going to start to tread, and you'll see how we go very quickly from a very simple measure to a very, very, very complicated measure, and we kind of land somewhere in the middle, maybe, because, well, how free? How fair? How do you know? Who gets to participate? How competitive are the elections? How often are the elections? How many elections have you had? And so the tension in international comparisons of democracy really comes down to, given that we agree that you can compare these, the tension really comes down to, do we want to have a minimalist measure that's pretty easy, closer to what we would consider objective, something that's pretty reliable over time, or so this person is in pain or not, or do we want a really, really complicated measure? This person is in this type of pain, it's been around for this long, it's this debilitating, this, but makes it really hard to kind of keep getting new information and compare over time.
Something in the middle.
Something in the middle. Right. So the simplest, I would say, working measure of democracy out there right now is something that's basically just the democracy dictatorship scale. A country either gets categorized as a democracy or not. You're not getting into gradients. I'm not like a 10 and you're a 9 or anything like that. It's just a 0 or a 1. And it's based on, have you had elections? But it's also based on, are these elections satisfying a number of properties? So these properties include things like ex-ante unpredictability. So the election has to be not predictable ahead of time.
Right.
That already gets a little difficult because while I don't think that the November 2024 election in the United States was particularly predictable, someone could look back and be like, I knew he was going to win the whole time, right? And so you get into already some subjectivity. But in general, the election has to be not able to be predicted ahead of time, which rules out a ton of countries. It has to be ex post irreversible. It also has to include Latin phrases for no reason. Ex post irreversible.
You can't reverse it at the end.
Exactly. You can't get to the end and say, actually, the other guy won.
Yeah.
Which I thought about a lot on January 6th, 2021. And some people in this country would claim is still an issue. And so we violated that, and that would tip us out of democracy category. And then the other one is repeatability. You have to have a number of these. It's not enough to just have one election and say, ta-da, I'm a democracy.
Yeah.
So there's a couple other criteria, but basically it's this checklist. And if you tick all of those, according to this simplest measure in the world, you're a democracy. So the United States is still a democracy. It's been a democracy. And we don't get that level of nuance.
Yeah.
There's a teeny tiny problem with that in the validation stage. Where the validation stage, we look at this list and we say, here are all the countries marked democracy. Here are all the countries marked autocracy. There's a couple of countries that end up in kind of a funny place where some of the other criteria that we've skipped are you need to have some kind of change in power over time. But Japan and Mexico, for example, we consider those largely democratic countries. The same party was in power forever. Is that a sign that they're an authoritarian system, or is that a sign that they're just a really popular democratically elected party?
Yeah.
And so even this simple measure still has some fuzzy areas. There are a couple of countries that fall through the cracks on that measure. So that's one way of thinking about it. Do you think do you feel satisfied that we've measured democracy?
No. So
Okay.
since you bring up the medical analogy, so sometimes when we're tracking a patient, you can't just have a binary measure.
Like sick, not sick.
Yeah, you're in heart failure, you're not in heart failure. Because we want to predict that they're heading in that direction so that we can take some preemptive steps, or there are interventions you do along the way. So I feel like we need a measure that's not so binary. We need to know when we're a healthy democracy versus a problematic democracy versus like on the brink of maybe technically a democracy, but on the brink of authoritarianism.
Right. So until very recently, and maybe is still my favorite measure of democracy, is I had to set it aside because it's no longer being updated. And one of the problems with measuring democracy is it's really, really hard. It requires a lot of people. And until very recently, it depended on NSF funding. And it wasn't cut out during the 2025, but the funding has faded. And so we don't have numbers past about 2020. But it's the polity 4 data set. I think now they have a polity 5. So a polity is a term that did not catch on outside of political science, and it basically just means like a regime type or a type of government. And they did exactly what you're describing, which is they said, okay, it's not enough to just say democracy, dictatorship. We want to say something like full democracy, flawed democracy, or partial democracy, depending on what glass half full, half empty, trending towards full democracy. There's what they call an anocracy, another term that did not catch on, but basically a mixed regime. And then you can have something heading towards authoritarian or full authoritarian.
Yeah.
And you could really even lump those in there. And so largely the way they use those numbers is countries get a score from 10, which is full, perfect, ideal democracy, all the way down to -10, which is the most, dictatorship there ever was. And then a 0 is sort of halfway between. And so largely there's a cutoff that's been built. And this is somewhat arbitrary, is if you're a 6 or higher on this scale, you're a full democracy. If you're a -6 or lower, you're a full autocracy. And if you're in the middle, you're in the middle.
You're in the middle, right.
And so an innovation they add to the elections piece is that's in there. But there's also a piece that is of very great interest to me, and I think of great interest to the United States, which is constraints on the executive. So once you elect someone into power, and whether they're mostly focused on the head of state, but maybe you can think about legislators as well, but the head of state, once they're in power, how much can they do? And so as the executive power expands, we would imagine that the democracy level, the ability of individuals to control the outcomes of things goes down.
Right.
So if the executive is not properly constrained, then you're going to see a lower score as well.
Yeah, because otherwise you could be electing a dictator for 4 years at a time.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And so they have a couple other metrics in there, but that's the main departure. And I think it's a pretty elegant one, because sometimes when I talk, particularly when I would teach this with my students, we'd say, well, what do we think about when we think about democracy? And some of the ones that we haven't talked about yet, well, freedom of speech or freedom of assembly or freedom of religion, like various sort of liberties and things like that, or civil rights. That we've still left all of that out.
Yes, but a lot of them include that in the measure, like freedom of the press. Like, how can you have a democracy without freedom of the press?
Right. Well, in these particular measures, we've left that out completely. Yeah. And the argument is that maybe you don't need to know all that stuff in order to get enough gradation to say, oh, okay, this is a democracy and this isn't. Because remember, the trade-off is that the more information we require to come to a score, the harder it is to get that score, and the more we're going to tread in sort of more subjective territory. There's no easy number for how free the media is. You kind of have to have experts weigh in.
Yeah, but the trade-off the other way, though, is that you end up with a really good, objective, simple measure that's completely worthless.
Totally.
It doesn't tell you anything.
Totally.
Like, for example, we bring up freedom of the press as one, and freedom of speech and all of that. Because you could have, from what I understand, you could have an information autocracy, right? Where you have all the trappings of democracy, but the information is completely controlled by some authoritarian government, and therefore they could engineer whatever outcome they wish.
Right.
And so you can't, in my opinion, and this goes, I think, all the way back to the framers, like you can't have a democracy without information. Like, your vote means nothing if it's based upon misinformation.
Right. You're not making decisions over. I still like your opening statement of democracy. It's like citizens make decisions over stuff.
Yeah.
You're not making a decision over stuff if you're being fed the information.
If you're being distracted. Look over there while we do what's really going on.
You're making the decision they want you to make. So all right. So we have a third piece added in here, which is this idea that there's some sort of freedom of the press, independent media, flow of information, and that gets us into an even more complicated measure, which maybe you've seen out there in the world, called the Freedom House Index. And that's something that they have reports every year. Until recently, like I said, Polity was updated as well, not in the same kind of fancy reports because it's academic versus more public-facing. But so the Freedom House Index and the Economist Intelligence Unit both release annual rankings of countries by democracy scores. And in general, I'm oversimplifying, but in general, they include metrics both for political, institutions and health of the institutions, all that stuff that we just talked about, and some form of like political culture, independent media. The Freedom House Index in particular is interested in, are journalists put in jail? Are they censored from saying things? And how do you think you get that sort of information at a cross-national level?
I don't know, that's really tricky. You have to do some kind of systematic survey of.
So this is where it starts to get frustrating, I think. It's not to diminish the value of it, but in order to start to ask the questions that we're really interested in, like, okay, we hit democracy according to the structure of the country. The rules look like a democracy, but in practice, no one feels safe speaking their mind. No one feels safe voting against the main party. No one feels safe disagreeing. No one trusts the news, all that kind of stuff. That's not going to show up in most metrics yet.
Yeah.
There's a version of the world where with advances in AI and more interest, I hope, among maybe people watching this in getting involved in measurement, it's a very overlooked stage in the data science process. More people getting involved in thoughtful measurement, maybe you could start to track, how often does the national news track with what the leader says and then make a ratio of some sort of thing. And maybe, but that's not there yet. So Freedom House Index, Economist Intelligence Unit are both largely based on expert surveys. So you go around and you say, here are 5 people who are an expert in Switzerland, and they're going to answer a battery of questions about each of these countries, and they're going to give a score, and then we're going to compare those scores over time. So it's basically, tell me if I'm wrong, kind of like asking you have one patient and you have 5 different doctors, and you say, okay, all of you diagnose, and then we'll compare and kind of go with the mean. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's roughly the idea.
Yeah, and sometimes we do that with complicated cases. We do have like tumor board, where people get together and they from all different specialties and they all have their input and come.
Tumor board?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a grim name.
Yeah. Well,
let's all get together and talk about this tumor.
Well, basically, if you have a patient with cancer and you have to talk to you need a surgeon and the oncologist and the radiation oncologist and the internist and whatever, maybe another subspecialist, all need to have input into the best course of action. So yeah, it's a similar kind of thing where you need a bunch of experts weighing in.
And then it's, if they disagree, then you have a question of, are we going with the mean? Are we doing like figure skating judging where we throw out the highest and lowest or whatever the way it adds up? So one of the benefits of this is that it does at least give you numbers that we think are a little bit more three-dimensional on a country. The trade-off is that it's what people think. And so you kind of lose the original one with just elections is nice because you can't argue. You had an election or you didn't. The outcome was either reversed or it wasn't, and so on. Whereas over here, you're starting to say, well, do I think these experts are correct? I generally do. I don't have a major reason to dispute, but I will say, having talked about this research out there in the world, anyone who thinks that there is going to be some kind of inherent research bias or a liberal bias or a this bias or that bias, you kind of you lose that transparency because particularly Freedom House and the Economist Intelligence Unit a lot of their work is paywalled, a lot of it is proprietary, so you don't really get the transparent open data that you hope for. Which brings us to the one that I claimed was my favorite one, and it is very good. My original favorite still lives with Polity 5. I think that's a nice, elegant one, but it's not being updated, where it's called the Varieties of Democracy Index. And so what they've done is it's still an expert survey, but it's transparent. So you know what the numbers are and every single piece of it. You don't just get like a colorful map and wait till next year. You have all the sub-questions and everything in there that you could look at. And what's interesting about what they do is they say, well, democracy can take a lot of different forms. A country could be very democratic in terms of how they have elections, but not so democratic in terms of how they make decisions with one another. So if we have fair elections, but we argue all the time and we can't get anywhere once we're elected, then that's a different sort of democracy than one that has amazing elections and everyone also is ready to roll up their sleeves and work together. So they offer, you don't just get one score, you get 5 scores for the Varieties of Democracy Index. So every single country gets 5 scores. You can then add those up and say, what's the winning one? Which is where we got Denmark from before. So, for example, in Varieties of Democracy, you can get measured according to your deliberative democracy health, so the extent to which you have hearty, healthy conversations about policies and their trade-offs. You can have egalitarian democracy, where everyone can participate, everyone has a chance to be a part of it. Electoral democracy, good elections like we talked about. Liberal democracy, so that's the kind of civil liberties that we talked about, and freedom of expression, things like that. And you can also have a participatory democracy where it's not just enough to have elections and everyone could vote, it's that they actually do vote. It's not that everyone could run for office, it's that they do run for office. So all of those are different flavors of democracy. And so the United States is doing worse as of 2024. Remember, this doesn't include 2025. The numbers for the United States on pretty much all of these dimensions is lower than it was in previous years. Do you want to guess, and you don't have to, do you want to guess where we're particularly weak? Which of those 5 dimensions?
So it's participatory, electoral, and liberal, egalitarian, deliberative. I would say liberal.
We're not doing great on liberal, but it's not that one. The answer is deliberative.
Okay.
So we
because the Congress is
we just scream at each other.
FUBAR, yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just Congress; it's even individuals and how we talk about policies. And I would say that our show is aiming to improve our deliberative democracy score. But if you look at the scores for the United States over particularly, say, the last 5 to 10 years, we were doing relatively okay, not amazing compared to our, Scandinavian countries that always do great, but we were doing okay. And then you see a real dip in the last couple of years, and a lot of it is driven by a fall in deliberative democracy. Mm-hmm. I will also say that the Varieties of Democracy Index has released, as has the Polity 5, they came back from the dead and released a special announcement based on observations they've just made over the last few years. So not the same kind of rigorous empirical work that we hope, but just to say, hey, we're experts in this and we're paying attention. VDEM, at the end of their 2024 report, which came out in like February of 2025. So it was something like just a few weeks into the Trump administration. And remember, this is an international publication about all countries. They had a whole section just dedicated to the United States and the things that were going on that concerned them in Trump's first 6 weeks in office. So I think we should have a giant VDEM index reveal party slash
when does it come
funeral.
out for 2025?
I would guess it's going to be late February, early March.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like we need to revisit this when the 2025 numbers are out as an update, see where we are, where are things headed, and even dive deep into specific features, like what specific things have happened that have undercut American democracy, because this is obviously a huge issue.
Yeah, and I can give you a few if you want to hear of things that they pointed to. And again, this is not the full research, but it's what they've kind of more anecdotally put together. Is so pardoning 1,500 January 6 convicted criminals is what they consider to be a tacit endorsement of future violence. It's all kinds of firing of heads of offices and independent inspectors general. Basically, anytime we're getting rid of someone who's meant to be an independent oversight, again, that falls under that executive constraint piece, but also some of the other checks and balances sorts of things. Military purges, the various things that have happened that we think are or were constitutional crises. To your point earlier, there's a massive intimidation of the media and threats to sue outlets that use anonymous sources, limiting access to the room. Pretty much everything that happened with Doge and USAID are considered to be largely undemocratic. And I will also, and replacing civil servants with personal loyalists. So these are all disappointingly unimaginative authoritarian moves, according to this outlet.
Right.
I will say I guess this, I'm not even sure if this is in the spirit of being unbiased, but I recently presented some of this, and I did get a question from someone who thought that all of this had a liberal bias to it, and that it wasn't taking into account some of the more, socialist and communist type things that people on the left are saying. I didn't see anyone in VDEM commenting on that, though I will also observe that they come out of Northern Europe, and so generally they're further left of us. The experts are not, that they pull into their surveys. But this is what why I have maybe a little more sympathy for the more simple measures, because you do lose some nuance, but it's a lot harder to argue with. And so you could say, well, this is a list of things, but you've left out a bunch of things, or why didn't you freak out when Biden expanded all these other powers?
Yeah.
And in general, you think about expansion of electoral power and a limit of constraint on the executive. We saw a ton of that during Biden, if you think about policies during COVID. A lot of it was under Trump as well.
Yeah.
But there are circumstances where parties on the left and the right in the United States have expanded the executive power.
Yeah, that's been bipartisan over the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
Going back, from what I understand, like even to the 70s, 80s, there's been a continuous slow march of increased executive power and unconstrained power. And that has been absolutely bipartisan.
I will also say that the numbers for the U.S. So the U.S. until when I first started teaching this stuff, I was teaching maybe about 10 years ago. The U.S. always topped the charts. It was like on the polity score, it was a 10 out of 10. And in 2020, they came back. The researchers came back, and then in the most recent years said that the United States is now no longer a democracy. Again, based on just their not so quantitative, but their external assessments. But the U.S., even according to some of the other measures, so the Economist Intelligence Unit, the Freedom House, we used to really be top, if not 10, 9, or whatever the score is that these different parties were using. And in general, we've fallen even well before 2025. And we're in a flawed democracy or not so perfect. We used to be an A+ student, and then for a while we were sort of a B+ student, and now, depending on what measure you use, we are lower and lower.
Right.
And outfits, I mean, I think, I don't know if all these reports come out at the same time, but I'll be also very interested to see how the Freedom House does it and the Economist Intelligence Unit and how they update those numbers. At a global level, I can also say, I just have nothing but bad news for you. At a global level, also up until about 10 years ago, researchers generally saw more of the world democratizing, whether you measured it in terms of number of countries or percentage of countries that were democracies or percentage of the world's population that lived under a democracy.
Yeah.
Those numbers were basically going up until about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, and now those numbers are really plummeting worldwide. So the United States is of special interest to us, to a lot of researchers, including researchers outside the United States, but it's not the only country that's exhibiting this kind of democratic backsliding.
Right. Do you think it's part of a global trend?
I do. And it's a massive question of why is this happening? The big levers that are talked about are rise of populism as well as economic inequality.
Globalization, is this like all a reaction to globalization?
Maybe. I mean, when I was in college, globalization was like the greatest hope for the world, and then that quickly fell apart.
Right.
When 9/11 hit.
Yeah, I've also heard some people say that this is just the 2 steps forward, 1 step part rhythm of history. This is what always happens, right? So we're just in a 1 step back phase, but if you back up a little bit, we still tend to march forward. I mean, obviously we'll see, but hopefully that's the optimistic view.
One of the benefits of these simpler measures is that you can't go back in time and survey someone in 1890 about these questions, but you can use some of these more quantitative measures of elections and that sort of thing. And you can actually look at the United States. It goes back to early 1800s about how democratic it was. And it really plummets during the Civil War. And it kind of comes back up, and then it comes back up, and then we did okay, and then we're down, and then now, as I said, the researchers are making a guess, but they think that we're back down out of democracy territory for the first time since the Civil War. Yeah. But that doesn't negate your point that it's still a cyclical thing. You just have to deal with the cycles.
Right. Okay, let's do one They Said What before we close out this episode.
Very good.
So Trump famously put out on his Truth Social after Mark Kelly and other Congress people, 6 people, put out a video saying basically, it's in the Uniform Code, right? You not only can refuse to obey illegal orders, it's your duty to disobey illegal orders. This is true. It is in the law. And Trump's reaction to that was, this is sedition punishable by death. Essentially. I mean, you said a lot of other things about it too. You were just ranting on it for quite a time. But that's the money quote, right? This is seditious and punishable by death. So, first of all, it's not sedition, right?
It's stating a fact, I believe.
It's stating something that is true. And you have to sort of put it. It's also interesting that Trump interpreted it's okay to disobey illegal orders. He said of that, they're saying to disobey me. So he made that leap from illegal orders to his orders. Just saying, he made that leap. But in any case, you could look at the law as written. Sedition requires an attempt to forcefully overthrow the government.
Yes.
Right? It's either the overthrow or destruction of the U.S. government by force. And every sort of subset of that is by force. It's not just saying, hey, by the way, you should not follow illegal orders. So it's not sedition. Also, it's not punishable by death unless you're in the military, which of course is why they're now raising the specter of like recalling Kelly back to the military so that they could try him under military regime, where it is sedition is punishable by death. But even within the military, this is still not sedition.
It's not sedition.
It's still not sedition. So that is
concerning.
It is concerning. I mean, certainly whenever you bring up the specter of, I'm going to, threaten my political opponents with death for basically advocating for their political side, or for some political point, or just exercising their freedom of speech. Obviously, that's concerning. But it's also, considered to be bullying and to have, I don't think anybody expects that this is going to happen. Like they're going to be, actually convicted of sedition and executed. But it's meant to have a chilling effect. This is again how you bully people into following the regime, into silence, into not being critical, or at least that's the attempt.
And that gets into the distinction in these measures between, are we talking about things that are built into the rule books or things that are actually happening on the one hand, or this culture and fear and intimidation on the other? And it's harder to measure those things, but there's absolutely a chilling effect, I think. And I think we'll see it in a lot of these measures that we just talked about.
Yeah.
But except for the one that's just about elections, we're kicking along on that one. But all of the others, I mean, you're creating a culture of fear, even if you don't ever actually do a single thing.
Right.
Just posting that statement on Truth Social is enough to potentially stymie the ability for other people to speak up or speak out against the regime.
Yeah, I guess democracy is like pornography. You know it when you see it.
There you go.
But it's hard to put a hard number on things that are conceptual at the end of the day.
I'm sure someone has tried to put a number on pornography, but
probably.
we'll leave it for another day.
All right. All right, we'll see you next time.